So if we're going to talk about rape, let's talk about different types of rape first. So here's our sort of a variety of different types of rape. So you have like gang rape, which just involves multiple offenders. Typically, these are more violent offenses, which makes sense. Serial rapes, this is where you have multiple crimes. You may have a pattern where the offender escalates, but they tend to be much more specialized. So these serial rapists tend to rape and they don't really commit many other types of crimes. Acquaintance rape is any situation where the perpetrator is known to the victim, and this is, most rapes are acquaintance rapes, but very reduced reporting amongst these types, and for a variety of reasons, but typically you have very low reporting rates. So one type of acquaintance rape is date rape, and it's, it can occur on like first dates, which is why it's called date rape, but anytime, within any kind of relationship. Very prevalent amongst college students. And then marital rape is another kind of acquaintance rape. And so this is, where somebody rapes their spouse. Not actually a crime until the early 1980s when it was finally criminalized. Prior to that, it was basically like, blanket consent because you married the person and so you can never say no to sex. So they realized that, oh, no, maybe it should be considered a crime. But it's treated less harshly than other sexual assault. So if somebody charges their spouse with rape, then it's still like, oh, well, it's technically a crime, but it's not as bad as some of these others. And then there's statutory rape, which is sex between an adult and an underage minor. So in Montana, that age restriction is that the cutoff is 16. Changes from state to state, but 16 is pretty common. So it doesn't matter if there was quote-unquote consent given by the child, because the child cannot give consent. So when we're talking about different types of rape, there are two main typologies that I want to talk about. And the first is Groffs Rapist typology. So this is basically a way to take all of the umbrella idea of rapists, because they're not all the same, and break them down into groups that are more similar. So this is what Groffs Rapist typology looks like. So you have your anger rapist, your power rapist, and your sadistic rapist are kind of the extreme purist types. And so these subtypes are based on criminal behavior as well as motivations. And not all individuals are going to fit neatly into a single category, and they may display characteristics or motivations from multiple subtypes, which is why I've sort of presented it as this overlapping Venn diagram. But sort of, we talked about the purist type. So let's start with the anger rapist. So the anger rapist, just like what it sounds like, they express anger and hostility that's built up. They typically have violent relationships in their lives. They displace their hostility and resentment on their victims. There's going to be excessive force in these kinds of crimes because they're angry. So they're going to be physically and verbally aggressive. There's going to be physical injury. Often there's humiliation of the victim because they're just mad and angry and they want to get back at somebody. It's typically also a more spontaneous and impulsive crime. There's some kind of precipitating life stressor that just like snap. And then they just snap and they have to go out and find somebody to take their anger out on. The power rapist, this is a situation where the person wants control over the victim. The victim is a possession to the offender. And so typically offenders who commit these kinds of rapes they have feelings of inadequacy. They are controlled by other people in their life, in their daily life. And so they're insecure. They feel like they don't have a lot of power. They're insecure about masculinity in particular. And they use rape to feel more powerful and to feel strong. And so there's a lot of planning and premeditation, much more in the power rape types compared to the anger rape types. And because they need to find specific victims. They're looking for vulnerable, easy targets, because a power rapist is trying to show they're powerful. They don't want their victim to get away or to overcome them, or overpower them. They want an easy, vulnerable target. And so they may be triggered by threats to either their competency or to their masculinity. That may be what sets them off. And then there are the sadistic rapists. These are the most dangerous type. So these people get pleasure and excitement, including sexual arousal, from the infliction of harm. So it is sexually arousing to them to be harming other people, and for their victim to be, they enjoy the victim's fear, they enjoy the victim's suffering. And so these cases, it's going to be extremely abusive. They're going to use restraints, torture, mutilation. They may kill their victims, the most likely to kill their victims usually. And there's going to be considerable planning and premeditation because they want it to be a certain way. It typically coincides with sadistic sexual fantasies, and so they want things to play out a specific way that they've imagined it in their heads. So victims are targeted and stalked as well. So that's, again, plays into that planning and premeditation, because part of their fantasy is the victim has to look a certain way or talk a certain way or move a certain way or whatever, and dress a certain way. So they want specific victims that play into that fantasy. So that's Groffs Rapist typology. Now, again, it's not all rapists fit nicely and neatly into one of these categories. And often this doesn't sort of account for a lot of the some of the acquaintance rapes. Some of them do fall into this. I mean, a lot of acquaintance rapes are power or anger, but some are purely opportunistic, and they don't sort of really fall into any of these categories. And so Nightprinz came up with their typology that kind of includes a broader spectrum of rapists. And so this is known as the MTCR3, which just comes from what the data set that they used, which was the Massachusetts Treatment Center Rapist Typology. And it's version 3, which is why it's R3. So it was an amazing sample that they used. Just the rapists from the MTC sample are, there's 254 of them. So that's a pretty big sample to come up with a typology like this. So this is what it looks like. It looks a little maybe intimidating or confusing, but let's break it down. It's actually not. It's actually very easily understood as to what's going on here, if you know what's going on. So it's broken down by the primary motivation here. That's the main axis. It's the motive characterizing the offense. So you have opportunistic, pervasively angry, sexual, and vindictive. So opportunistic, just like what it sounds like, it's crimes of opportunity, and there's no planning involved, and it's just there's some kind of opportunity involved. Pervasively angry, these types are they're literally just angry at the world. They are angry at everybody. They hate everybody, and it's very similar to Groff's anger rapist. So in terms of what the crime would look like and things like that. So this is just people who are very angry and they want to take out that anger on somebody. The sexual motivation, this is where the primary motivation is sex. And so people like to think that, I've had arguments with people at conferences and elsewhere before about people who think that all rape is about power, and it isn't. Some rape is, but some rape is about sex. And so you can't take away that idea that some rape is just about sex. And so that's sort of what is accounted for here in Nightprinz. It doesn't mean that there isn't power some underlying motivation, but the primary motivation is sexual. Now that can be broken down though into sadistic or non-sadistic. So sadistic is very similar to Groff's sadistic rapist, with the idea that it's very dangerous and it's some of the worst kind of stuff. There's humiliation and violence and injury and things like that. And then non-sadistic sexual is where it's just about sex, and the person wants sex and they can't get it any other way. And so they come up with some way to get it from somebody who doesn't want to give it to them. And so they're not getting sexual pleasure from inflicting pain. They're just taking sex from somebody who doesn't want to give it to them. So that's the sort of non-sadistic sexual component. And then the vindictive, so these offenders are, it's actually kind of similar to angry in the sense that, Groff's anger rapist in the sense that they are angry, but the vindictive is specifically they're angry at women. They hate women. And this is because, like, virtually all rapists are men, so we know that men can be raped and that women can be the assailants, but overwhelmingly, like 99.9% of rapists are men. Victims could be men or women though, but so typically though, when we look at vindictive rapists, they hate women, and so they are taking out that hatred on their female victims. And so there's sort of some stuff in common with like sadistic and pervasively angry in terms of there's going to be humiliation of the victim and things like that, torture potentially. but it's a separate motivation. It's a separate reason. It's not about sexual motivation. It's about they just hate women. So an interesting thing as well about, and I mean, there's other sort of like type differentiation based on level of social competence, and then with the sadistic, whether it's overt or muted. But I just sort of want you to get the main differentiation of these main motivations. And the types are actually also arranged so that those that are juxtaposed to each other are more alike than those that are more distal. So like, type 6 and 7 are much more similar than type like 2 and 7. So it's actually really interesting how they did that. So it's not perfect, but it's the ones that are closer together have more in common than the ones that are further apart. So that's kind of interesting too. So when we're talking about rape, then there are some different ideas in terms of what causes it. So there is the idea of evolution and biology, because rape is an evolutionarily adaptive technique. We don't like to think of it that way, but when you think from an evolutionary perspective, rape is one way to pass on your genes. If you can't do it in the way that everybody else is doing it, where everybody's on board and you have a family and whatever, if you can't get that, then from a biological, deep down evolutionary perspective, you still want your genes to be passed on. So rape is one way to do that. And that was sort of covered previously when we talked about the RK theory. So that's one possibility, sort of, and again, it's not that somebody is thinking that cognitively, that's just sort of what drives some of our base instincts. So male socialization is another one that could be a potential cause for rape, because males are taught to be aggressive, they're taught to be forceful, they're taught to be dominant. And so if you're taught that all your life and you have a situation, say, where a woman rejects you or makes fun of you or calls you out on your masculinity, that's going to be something that if you've been taught all your life to be aggressive and forceful and dominant, you're going to respond with aggression and force and dominance to that situation. So that's kind of an overall societal level factor, but certainly because men are taught that it's bad to be passive and it's bad to let other people dominate you, then this socialization could play into why, especially when we're trying to explain why it's men who overwhelmingly are the perpetrators. There's also, we can look at psychological abnormalities. Rapists, especially serial rapists, often have a personality disorder or a mental disorder of some kind, of mental illness. A significant proportion of incarcerated rapists have psychotic tendencies, psychopathy, or other personality disorders, like narcissistic personality disorder is a pretty common one. So there may be something psychologically different. So like evolution and biology and socialization, we're talking large scale. Psychological abnormality, we're talking sort of for the individual, the people who are doing this, there's something different about them. There's something that is not the same as everybody else in terms of how their brains work. And cognitive distortions kind of play into that as well in terms of seeing the world not the way that everybody else does. And then there's social learning. If you learn from other people, or if they were victims themselves, there's a learning process that happens here. Again, this is sort of looking at more of a micro level explanation. But if somebody is learning that this is how you treat women, if a little boy grows up and he sees his dad assaulting his mother on a regular basis and it's normalized, then of course he's going to be more likely to do that as an adult. That's how learning works. And if somebody is a victim of a sexual assault themselves, then oftentimes, especially if that victim is a young boy and then he grows up and he would rather be the aggressor, because in his mind that is the powerful one compared to being the victim or continuing to feel like the victim. So there's definitely a learning component as well. And then of course there's the sexual motivation. So like I was talking about, sometimes rape is just about sex, and it's most likely to be about sex when the offender is younger and when it's a less violent crime. So sometimes it's just that somebody wants sex and they can't get it, or they're drunk, or whatever the case may be. Not an excuse, but an explanation for why this person has committed a criminal offense. So those are just sort of some of the purported causes of rape, and looking at macro level and micro level, and it's obviously going to be some combination of some or all of these that really explains why people commit rape.